here's what we're going to do. You can insert the remark, and then I was actually going to give the floor to my father, who, because he is here in the same place, pulled rank and said, I'd like to ask a question. So the fourth commandment requires that. But I think his question it bears on the last panel we just had with Father. Move on to the many other excellent questions. And again, I invite you all to be submitting your questions, and Christopher and I together will be trying to sift through them and bring as many of them to the faculty as possible. So Joseph, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, my remark is in part motivated by reading many of the chats in which all of them that I read, in which it is emphasized that the contemplation is an act of the intellect. And that goes through these comments, and also, of course, Father Wendt said that. And of course, Hildebrand does not deny that. But I think one of the great contributions of his chapter on contemplation in the transformation in Christ is that he says that he first agrees with Aristotle, giving the whole list of reasons why Aristotle says that the contemplative life is superior to the active life. And these are very beautiful and lengthy catalogue of perfections of the contemplative life compared to the active life. But then Hildebrand says that it is a great error to believe that only the intellect is part of the contemplative life. And he says that the affective life and that love is not less contemplative than the intellect, and that therefore one should not, so to speak, attribute that priority of the contemplative life over the active life to the intellect alone, and believe that the other spiritual faculties, in particular the heart, are, so to speak, excluded from that superior life which only the intellect can enjoy, but that the contemplative life, so to speak, permeates also contemplative activation of love, or of other, maybe also of the will, of certain virtues of the will. So therefore, so to speak, that the contemplation that begins with the contemplation of the intellect spills over or informs and allows fully to partake in the contemplative life also love.
Thank you, Joseph. Have we lost you? Thank you very much for that. Professor Crosby, why don't you?
Yes, I had just one follow-up question, also on contemplation, but on the question of not contemplation extended to created goods, and not exclusively to God. And what Father Brent said in response was quite understandable, that we first of all contemplate God and then finite and created goods in God. But there's a thought of von Hildebrand's here worth mentioning. I think you'll agree with it, but it's a signature thought of his, and that is that finite goods, when contemplated, must never be, though related to God, must never be instrumentalized in relation to God. That a mere instrumental relation between finite persons and other created goods and God would be inappropriate. It would not do justice to the finite goods. And you know, there is maybe are certain tendencies in traditional Christian practice where one says that we perform, let's say, good deeds to our neighbor because that gives us an occasion to love God. So if the finite person is just an occasion for doing good, loving God, then it has to become more thematic. It has to be somehow, the finite good, honored as something splendid in its own right, according to von Hildebrand. It's an important point because I hear a lot of critics of Christian personalism saying, you all with your talk of the dignity of the person, the inviolability of the person, never able to be used, you exalt the person unreasonably into a divine being. But the truth of the matter is that there's a point of participation of the finite person in God that leads us to say persons are violated if ever just instrumentally used. Not even God. Wojtyła often made that point, uses his created persons. We speak of the providence of God and Lord, make me an instrument of your purposes, says St. Francis. But the idea of an instrumental using of us created persons by God was abhorrent to Wojtyła, as to von Hildebrand. So there's this idea very dear to von Hildebrand that we Christians have to do full justice to the created world. And that is in part done by abstaining from any using. We don't order the created world to God by setting it in some instrumental relation to him. So that just as a further Hildebrandian thought on that point about contemplation.
Father James or Joseph, would you like to offer a comment on that before we move on?
I think just quickly, when St. Thomas thinks of contemplation, and here I'm really speaking in terms of contemplative prayer, something taking place by grace, and not simply philosophical or say metaphysical contemplation. St. Thomas wants us to contemplate God and then things coming forth from God and things returning to God. So to have that basic framework, so it's a world of participation. But there's no doubt that St. Thomas finds a help in the philosophy of Aristotle and the philosophy of nature in saying that things around us in the world, they have their own integrity, they have their own nature. And if we're contemplating them truly for what they are, we see and we behold that they have their own integrity. So we wouldn't be contemplating them truly if we saw them as merely useful or merely useful goods, instead of being things that were both good in their own right and for the sake of something further. So I don't think there would be a disagreement there.
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so at all.
But it's a good point.
So here's a question that really could be addressed by many people. In a way, we're missing Anthony Stadlin for this, but Derek, you could take this, or Rocco, you might have something to say on this. So I'll just read the question from Paul Ruff. I have attended as a guest for several of the presentations and have benefited greatly. As a psychologist whose practice is informed by attachment theory, the phenomenology of emotion, and social neurobiology, all of which relate to each other, I have considered the work of Hildebrand a very good grounding and deepening of what is revealed in my clinical work. Is there much dialogue between the psychology, and the Hildebrand Project, or maybe one should say between psychology and the thought of von Hildebrand? I think it could be very rich. Perhaps some of this occurred in the afternoon sessions, which I missed. And I say to you, Paul, if you are not in the group that is meeting today on mental health, we will send you a link because there are a number of people who want to discuss that. But Derek, in particular, do you have any thoughts? Your work perhaps comes closest to taking up these themes of psychology and personalism.
Yes, I think this would be somewhat better directed at Anthony, who really has thought quite deeply about this. The questioner asked about neuroscience, though, and I really do think there's a tight link. I have been reading the works of, as I mentioned, the articles of Joseph Seifert, and I have a personal interest in these matters, and I think a lot of psychology has taken up the work of neuroscience, and I think that's wonderful and splendid, but there are real dangers here in terms of materialism, in terms of the concept of efficient causality versus personal causality, So I think there's a rich dialogue. I'm only familiar with the work of Professor Seifer on this concept, but his articles are really worth reading, particularly his dialogue with Benjamin Libet, who was a psychologist who wrote a lot about neuroscience. So there's a lot of rich opportunities for this, but I also remain somewhat cautious on the neuroscience side. I also share with Anthony some of his critique of the prison system has been quite negative. I would say that there are lots of good psychologists and lots of people trying to help others, but Anthony has a lot to say about the history of psychology and the way it's been abused, and I share a great deal with his of his critique. He was friends with Thomas Satz, who was a very controversial man in the 20th century, but I also share some of that critique. So I would say there's wonderful opportunities, but there are tensions, and we have to be careful with, particularly with the neuroscience turn. There is a tendency toward a materialism that's quite problematic. So I thank the questioner for that question.
Yes, thank you for that. I should say here, it was just pointed out to me by one of the questioners that short of new questions, there were many excellent questions that people posed that could not be answered. So if there was a question that you had throughout the seminar that you would like to have answered, please feel free to submit that. These questions here do not have to be new questions that no one has posed yet, but you can certainly ask anything that has been on your mind. There is quite a number of good questions here. We're missing the presence of James Matthew Wilson. Here's a question that maybe a number of you could speak to, though, that touches on aesthetics. Mark, somehow you've popped up on my screen, so feel free to speak to this. But Tom Venzer asks here, I'm sure that, let's see here, he said, how do we bring beauty back to the people, especially to the poor? It seems that beauty sometimes is reserved for those who have the financial means to access it. In this sense, I mean beauty when it is manifest in poetry, artwork, music. How can we, and maybe it's through public policy, renew access to beauty for the more general population, and again, particularly for the poor? And before turning that maybe to you, Mark, I mean, that's a very Hildebrandian question insofar as when Hildebrand, in the beginning of the Aesthetics, speaks specifically about the importance of beauty, not just as an object of interest, say in the high arts, you know, when one contemplates paintings or literature or goes to concerts, but simply the beauty of the surroundings in which one lives. And he speaks about the soul absorbing that beauty and being nourished by that beauty. And I think I should also mention here again Roger Scruton, who has this wonderful notion of everyday beauty, which is frankly easy to overlook, even among people who care a lot about the arts, for example, because it's easy to think, well, that kind of thing doesn't matter, but it matters immensely. You know, the kind of environment that we live in and our children live in, something as simple as a well-ordered room, says Scruton, has a kind of beauty to it that is nourishing to the soul. But with those remarks, Mark, I know you think about this. Perhaps you could say something.
Yeah, I was really struck. Is this on? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
I was really struck by something Derek said during his talk about prisons, how they're designed to be devoid of beauty. And it really struck me that, I mean, this is not everyone's goal, but I take it that one goal we should have with respect to those in prisons is restoration, right? Reintegration into the community, training them in skills and so forth, so that they can be good members of the community and fully restored to that full membership. And it strikes me that there's a place where public policy could do a great deal to create a beautiful environment. I would think that would go, you know, many miles towards encouraging that sort of restoration. So it seems like there has to be a public policy side of this. So with respect to people in prisons and jails, with respect to not just people, not just the poor, but anyone living in an urban environment, there are many places of beauty in our cities, but there are many places wholly devoid of beauty in our cities. So encouraging public policy with respect to the establishment of parks, with respect to architecture, and things like this seems like it's particularly important for creating that beautiful environment. I guess a place I think about it a lot is in education. So we homeschool, my wife and I homeschool our children, but the arts are really central to the way that we do that. We do a lot of art appreciation. We have the kids enrolled in a lot of music classes, art classes, things like that outside of the home. And that just seems very important to us, that the role of beauty in one's education elevates all other aspects of one's education, elevates one's whole approach to life. So I think things like supporting policy in education that makes the arts a central part of education, and not just in a sort of purely aesthetic manner, but sort of permeating the whole of one's education, permeating the whole of the curriculum. Such that, for example, say in the sciences, this is a great place to contemplate beauty in nature. In literature, in history, there's all sorts of examples of moral beauty and other sorts of beauty there. So rethinking the way in which we educate people and encouraging policies that encourage rethinking the way we educate people, such that beauty with its elevating aspect is always there. Hildebrand always goes back to that phrase, sursum corda, lift up your heart. And that's what beauty does for us. So yeah, I think a lot in terms of public policy can be done there. But then also, I mean, just in your own personal contacts, so like me with my kids, me with my students, infusing beauty into those relationships, making beauty a central part of what we talk about in those cases, that's going to go a long way, maybe even more than public policy will, because it's got to start with those personal relationships and the beauty of those relationships. I could say more about that, but I think those are sort of the places where I think a lot needs to be done.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, Mark.
Mark, may I ask you a follow-up question on that? So, you know, when the question was raised initially, my first reaction was some kind of fear and thinking, well, if we're looking to make public policy that encourages the arts and beauty, what are these standards of beauty? I mean, I see a lot of art going up in my city, which is Cleveland, and I think, wow, that's an eyesore of a sculpture that's going up. But the aim in putting it up was to enhance the environment there.
Right. Yeah.
So this is something that I asked you, Mark, in an email. You know, what does von Hildebrand have to say about some standards by which we can judge whether something is beautiful? I mean, why is it the case that Beethoven's symphonies are superior to Stravinsky, or you know, some modern sculpture might be inferior to the Pietà, for example?
So I mean, yeah, Hildebrand has a lot to say about standards and so forth. I suppose with respect to this particular question, I don't want to instrumentalize beauty, but I want to go back to that phrase, the lift up your heart. What sort of effect does this have on the environment, right? I mean, various sculptures, various sorts of architectures. And I don't want to say all these things are measurable, but they are studyable in some way. That is, you can see what has been the effect, and you know, you can poll people and you can talk to people about what's the effect that different sorts of public art, public green spaces and so forth have had on people's actual lives. In what way have they improved people's lives? So I think in terms of public policy, I would want to go with things like that. Look at what the actual effects of these things have been. Maybe part of that is in some sense, sort of, in a sense, democratizing this, right? Like if there are pieces of public art going up that are not actually enlivening people's lives, right? Having this effect of an elevation of spirit, that's a good sign that maybe they were the wrong pieces of public art to commission, merely because some arts commission liked it, right? Or wanted to sponsor a certain artist. Maybe that was the wrong route to go. So I don't want to be a utilitarian about it, and I don't want to say everything is measurable, but in a sense, I think like with respect to the question that was asked, something about the sort of utility in terms of really helping people has to come into the conversation here.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
May I just say a word on this? At John Crosby's suggestion, I read one of Mark's articles on aesthetics. I really enjoyed it, and I corresponded with him on this topic. I do wish that von Hildebrand a little different. He's almost he comes from a certain background. I understand that, and I also agree with him about a lot of his understanding of the Renaissance. But if you read the two volumes of the aesthetics, there's no discussion of jazz or blues or Chinese art. And I've spoken to John Crosby about this, and he feels this is, that he could be that Mark does have some good points on this. I would recommend Mark's article on this because his principles could be, Mark makes the case that they could be applied more widely to modern art. And so that, I think his standards are really quite remarkable, but I was struck by the second volume of the aesthetics, where there just isn't any discussion of, he was in New York City for a couple decades and no discussion of jazz or blues or anything like that. So I would recommend Mark's contribution on this topic. I really enjoyed it.
And the principles I'm looking to in that paper are a lot of what Hildebrand talks about. It can be sort of summed up in the idea that art trains our perception. It trains us to see features of reality, aspects of beauty, aspects of being, other sorts of aesthetic values, that is, ways that things are important just by being perceived, that we wouldn't ordinarily perceive. And I think that the modern painterly tradition, lots of other non-mainstream and non-Western art traditions do this. That is, they train us to see certain aspects of reality that, say, the Western painterly or the Western art musical tradition don't, which is not to denigrate those traditions in any way. So thinking about art in those terms, and I'm no public policy experience whatsoever, so I have no idea how you would translate this into actual workable policy, but thinking about art as training us to perceive aspects of reality and then putting that into the choices we make about education and the place of the arts in education and the place that art has in our public spaces, I would want to see those sorts of standards being invoked. And the idea that there's something valuable about perceiving reality as it is, contemplating reality as it is, that needs to be a major part of our education system and a major part of our public life together.
Well, there's a lot to say on this, and we could pursue it further, but Christopher, I know you were going to...
Father James had his hand up.
Father James had a question.
Yeah, just one point. I want to chime in. I immediately thought of the liturgy when the question of making beauty available to the poor and underprivileged. That's one of the things the church has always done it, and all the high art of of Western Europe for the last 2,000 years has been, or almost 2,000 years, has been church-sponsored sacred spaces, cathedrals, liturgies, music. So an easy way to make beautiful things available to everyone is through the liturgy. I don't want this to become another kind of gripe session about the lack of beauty in the liturgy, but it's. I just want to make sure the thought is out there for people to think about.
Yes, thank you, Father. Christopher, were you going to?
Well, we keep talking here about policy, and I know that on our panel here, we have at least one former politician from whom we have not heard. I mean, I should first note that if Rocco gets to smoke a pipe, I get to smoke a pipe too.
Good. You have two.
Yeah, so this is an Italian pipe also, Rocco, in honor of you. But Rocco, I would...
Rocco actually served as Minister of Culture, no less, in Italy.
Yeah, so I would be very, very curious to hear if you would like to weigh in on this topic.
Well, I can share with
interrupt the pipe.
A couple of experiences. The day before yesterday, I went to a carpenter because we need some furniture for a small section of the castle that my wife has inherited near Rome. And I received from this carpenter the most beautiful class on pure perfections that I have had in the last, well, since I left the International Academy of Philosophy, since the class of Joseph Seifert. And I think Joseph would have been extremely happy in listening, and he could have led a very fruitful dialogue with this carpenter, because he explained to us that beauty is not in the thing. Beauty, because the thing is always one way or another. Well, it can be beautiful, but it is a partial beauty. It is not a perfect beauty. Perfect beauty, or beauty in itself, arises out of harmony or proportion. It was Leonardo, it was Plato when he explains what is beauty. And I asked him, well, where did you get these ideas? And he said, well, look, when I was a young man, I attended the Scuola dell'Arte, the School of Art. That is a school for handworkers, for carpenters. And there they taught me how you have to make furniture. And I have seen his pieces of furniture, and it was beauty embedded in material objects for everyday life. And of course, perhaps you do not notice it immediately. You must put these objects in your living space, and with time, they grow in you, and you grow in them. If you have had the experience, I think you have had, the experience of living in a place that is occupied with beautiful objects, they enter in the process of constituting your own soul. And it is also a relation of person to person. The person who bought the object, my wife, the person who made the object, the carpenter, and me who paid for the object. All three participate in this process. So the first thing that I would would say from the point of view of politics, the schools of handworkers, of carpenters, what are we doing with them? What is the attention that we give to this fundamental aspect of our jobs market, but also of our everyday life? By the way, there is a wonderful dialogue of Charles Péguy, Marcel ou de la Cité Harmonieuse, where Péguy explains the value of the work when it is well done, any kind of work when it is well done. A second experience, for a while I was minister for culture in Italy, and we made some interesting experiences. In jail, a jail for young people in Procida, a beautiful place near Naples, an old professor, a lady, taught the young criminals poetry. She read them poetry, and she encouraged them to write poetry. I was the minister. I was invited to. They made a kind of competition. I was invited to give a judgment on their composition. Well, to write poetry is always an exercise that does good to your soul. Of course, most of the poetry was not particularly valuable, but some of them had a tremendous depth of meaning. And the fact of reading together and discussing together on poetry had a tremendous effect. It was a way of re-educating young people who had had a wrong start in life. Another experience was we invited some of our best musicians. I don't know whether you know Abbado. Abbado is one of the leading directors in the world of today. Well, we invited him to make a new kind of orchestra. an orchestra with children coming from poor boroughs of the city and exposed to the danger of becoming criminals or in other ways of being damaged because of the environment. And they did, not only him, many other prominent musicians of the country entered in the construction of children's orchestras in the different cities of the country. And this also had a tremendous educational effect for the children, because you may love music, but to be able to this listening to music. And later, even when you listen to music, if you can play an instrument, you will listen in a different way. So for the children, it was a tremendous educational experience, but it was an experience also for the parents, for the people of the borough. When they played, they all came, and it was something that had a tremendous impact. The same we did with theater, to teach theater to children. I was inspired by the experience of Wojtyła with the theater of the world. I do not say we did exactly a theater of the world in Italy, but never, without the limitation of this experience, this also had an impact. It made young people more sensible to the value of the word, on the one hand, and of the value of truth, but truth as embodied in the life of persons. So I think our educational system is extremely poor as what regards beauty. It is poor because we do not think it is important. It is. It is successful. It is successful. If you make furniture that is beautiful, you will sell it. Also economically, it is successful. But it is more than an economic fact. You are happy in doing that. It was, I was deeply moved from the happiness of this man. He was so happy in talking about his works of art. It was minor art. Yeah, perhaps it was minor art, but it was art. And he was happy in doing that and in telling about that. And we were happy in listening. And we are happy now at the idea of having those beautiful things in our home. So we should give a different evaluation of the role of beauty in all the educational process for the formation of not just of the aesthetic sense, but of the soul of the person. Beauty helps to grow. And beauty is also a way of communicating among people. A friend of ours is now making us the present, an important psychoanalyst, by the way, is making us a present, a painting painted by herself. Well, it's beautiful, but it conveys more than just aesthetic beauty. It conveys the beauty of the soul and the objective beauty, the beauty of the object. There is a difference between objective beauty and beauty of the object. The beauty of the object is always, one way or another, a way of bringing in contact souls between them. So there is an enormous, and we are losing important values, because in the past, beauty was a fundamental educational instrument. Today, much less so. And well, I stop here.
Christopher.
Thank you, Rocco. I have lots more to say on that, but I'll pass now so we can just move on to another topic. Even though we've got great questions coming in about art, it means we'll just have to do more events on this. But I want to move to another question, so we can get to a few here. This is from Mario. Mario writes, this question is relevant to those trying to promote von Hildebrand in philosophical circles. Many of Hildebrand's arguments ultimately rely on the self-evidential disclosure of essences. But this procedure by students and professional philosophers is very often criticized as insufficiently discursive. And there's no shortage of contemporary philosophers who will simply deny that the important in itself is self-evidently distinct from the subjectively satisfying. Any thoughts on strategies for redeeming in our most skeptical philosophical colleagues the simple vision of the phenomena. And I would like to invite particularly Pete and Maria to speak on that. And I see John Crosby's nodding his head, so I want to hear what he has to say too. John, Pete, Maria, David.
We thought of you and Maria, Pete, you and Maria, because of your experience in the classroom, presenting Van Hildebrand also to younger students. So there's not only the attempt to bring him into academic circles, but also even just in the classroom.
Well, I'll give a brief response. In part, I have an easier job than many people who teach in non-Catholic and sort of non-traditional institutions, because Ave Maria does, I mean, the student body is more or less oriented towards truth and open to the reality of truth, take truth for granted. But the way I talk about it when we do some of the methodological issues around philosophical investigation and evidence and so forth is, first of all, give them Aristotle's dictum that really, if you don't have something self-evident at the beginning of your arguments, you go into an infinite regress. And I show them that any kind of deductive argumentation is always going to stand on something which is either simply an assumption, or if it's going to be solid, it has to be recognized to be self-evident. And of course, the self-evidence of some proposition doesn't mean that it can't be brought to evidence, that it can't be discussed, it can't be clarified, it can't be pointed to. One can do that. One simply can't argue deductively to it. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is, of course, I use the Hildebrand's distinction between the various different kinds of essences: accidental essences, contingent essences, and necessary essences. And go through the exercise of trying to have them experience the reality of a necessary essence and sort of what it's like, the bedrock that a necessary essence is. And sometimes it's difficult for them because they always think, oh, but somebody can still deny it. And I say, well, verbally you can deny it, but if you really think about, if you really focus on the essence itself, then it shows forth its own evidence. So there's just a little bit there. And of course, Hildebrand has a fantastic, I'll just say chapter 4 of his What is Philosophy, I give to my more advanced students, which is, I think, just an incomparable chapter on this very topic. So anyway, thank you, Pete, go ahead.
Well, thank you. No, you helped me formulate my thoughts. I think that the almost the only answer to the question is you have to find a way to bring the student to have their own experience of an insight into an objective truth. Once they have that experience, then they know what it is. I told a story yesterday in the education one about a student I had about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was such a simple thought. I was teaching Plato, and I just used the example of a triangle. And I got them to realize by talking around it that it's an objective truth that no human being invented and none of us can change. And I won't go through how I did it now, but it just struck this girl in the back of the room that she just got all excited and started, are you saying, first she was challenged, are you saying that a triangle is always true no matter what? But it was because she saw it that she was so excited. And it was just that then she dropped her education major and became a history major with a philosophy minor. I guess the answer is to find ways to have them experience for themselves an objective truth, have that lived experience of it. That's the best.
May I compliment what Peter just said by recalling the story of Professor Silver, who was the president of the Philosophy World Congress of Philosophy in Boston. And he started out with giving which is normally not heard in any Philosophy World Conference, with a blatant attack on the relativists, which are among them. And they said that the philosophers gathered here, most of them are relativists, and they destroy education, they destroy the culture, they destroy everything. And then he gave an example, and he said that he had a student who said all values are relative, we cannot know any value, and so on. And then he had her for exam, and he threw her paper on the ground, and he said that the paper fell so far that he will give her now an F. And she got extremely angry and went to him and said, "What kind of injustice is it? You give me an F simply because you throw my paper without reading it on the floor." And then he explained to her that if her relativism were true, then she would have absolutely no reason to protest and to call it unjust to give recording of his throwing her paper. And so he convinced her, so to speak, of the absurdity of her relativism by this example. And Hildebrand had a similar example when he had this debate with the famous Viennese positivist and ethical relativist. And after he said that only the values are just feelings and emotions, emotional responses, and there's nothing objective in them. And then the secretary of the rector came in with a letter of the rector, and this professor, after hours of debating relativism with Hildebrand, got all completely pale and said, "Oh, colleague, come, read this letter. What a blatant, terrible injustice the rector commits." And Hildebrand said that after he said all this about the subjectivity of value judgments, it became totally clear to him that there are objective justice and injustice, and he protested. And so I think such examples can also be helpful in educating people to see objective values, like this silver experiment. Call your student and give her an exam and a grade of how far you threw her paper away. And then she will come and then she will see that they are objective, that this is objectively unjust, and then start. Anyway.
Professor Crosby, I suppose I can just call you Dad at this point. I think the cat's out of the bag, but to the original question, which was more addressed to the philosophical community, and not necessarily to people who are simply relativists and who don't accept any of the fundamentals of Hildebrand's view, but even among people for whom the methodology is sometimes frustrating, and they. I have a friend who often says that he thinks that Hildebrand is simply, the books of Hildebrand are simply long paragraphs of descriptions and assertions. Or that another person sometimes says to me, this always feels to me primarily hortatory, as if it's supposed to sort of awaken in me, sort of maybe a prior belief or a reason to believe in these things for other reasons that are not actually offered in the works. So this is not maybe an infrequent complaint that's met, I think, even among people who would be sympathetic. I mean, there are people who agree with Hildebrand on all of the fundamentals. I mean, I think about questions of marriage, for example, but or aesthetics, or really in any aspect of his thought, the ethics, where they simply feel that there's a lack of this discursive element. What would you suggest to someone like that? Again, not this student who's just in denial about the existence of standards of justice, but someone for whom the texts of Hildebrand are frustrating for their lack of at least the perception of argumentation.
Yes. Well, there's one kind of argumentation that the phenomenologists all cultivated in a particular way, and that is approaching datum by way of revealing contrasts. So what comes to mind right away is Rudolf Otto in his wonderful book, The Idea of the Holy. He wants to capture this idea of numinous awe. And he brings in, for contrast, natural fear, natural awe, and says, now look at the contrast. Don't you see? There's something new in what I'm calling numinous. Or again, he draws various contrasts, like with explaining the holy. He says, now, the holy is not, as we Germans have been trained to think, simply moral goodness. And then with revealing examples, he shows the contrast between something morally outstanding and something distinctly holy. And so with von Hildebrand, you know, if he's talking about virtue, he will bring in for contrast temperamental dispositions, you know, and say to be temperamentally bold and aggressive, that's not the virtue of courage. You know, bring in acquired habits, acquired skills, like playing a musical instrument, and explain that's not what we mean by the virtue of courage or any other virtue either. So he is really, when you read the text closely, extremely resourceful in working with very revealing contrasts, which throw into relief the thing that he wants you to intuit. Now, in the end, nobody can spare the listener or the reader the labor of seeing the thing through itself in an intuition. Like Rudolf Otto says, if after all these contrasts you don't see the thing that I'm calling the holy, I suggest you put my book down. It has nothing to say to you. You're not ready for it. But before Otto has made that dismissive statement, he's gone through a lot of very subtle analysis that works with revealing contrasts and has tried, like the phenomenologists say, to bring to evidence something important through these contrasts. And one needs to read von Hildebrand close enough to see the complex and subtle contrasts that are at work as he brings different moral and aesthetic data to evidence.
It'd be interesting to hear from our Thomistic friends, Beth or Father Brent, if you all have this perception of not only the non-discursive character of von Hildebrand, despite notwithstanding what my father's just said, but whether you find some insufficiency in that, or do you in fact find the way in which von Hildebrand brings these different phenomena to evidence to actually be a strength in his work?
So in the tradition of Aristotle and St. Thomas, there's the three acts of the mind: the apprehension of what a thing is, or the essence, or quiddity. There's judgments that flow from that apprehension, and then there's further reasoning one can do from out of those judgments. And St. Thomas describes it that there's a kind of cycle here, that there's first comes an apprehension, then we form judgments, then there's reasoning, often in the form of raising puzzles or aporia, difficulties, and then there's distinctions that are drawn, which in turn reinforces, enhances, or develops the original apprehension. And then the process begins over. So what can happen in the intellectual life is a person can become frozen or more or less predominated by one of these moments. So some people can gravitate more towards just wanting to perceive and apprehend as if everything should be clear without reasoning. Others get caught in the moment of proof or discursive reasoning without lingering with apprehension for a good long time. And I take it that phenomenology grew out of a moment within Western intellectual development where the scientific and the discursive had become so dominant that the moment of apprehension had been crushed in some way. And the early Husserl wants to call us back to the contemplation of things and the apprehension of things in themselves. And so the method of bracketing in some way clears the deck of judgments or an excessive web of judgments or systems that had been built up that were actually obscuring the moment of apprehension. And the early phenomenologists call us back to kind of apprehension. So it's a method, as far as I can tell, that really enhances and promotes the moment of apprehension. That to me seems the power of it. And there's a great contribution to make there. But there's also a moment of dialectic in human intellectual life and a need for raising hard problems, aporia, drawing distinctions, trying to prove things. And those shouldn't be neglected either. So, but I appreciate phenomenology precisely because it surfaces that moment of apprehension and helps to cultivate it. It calls us back to just looking and seeing and observing the world.
I think that's an extremely interesting way of looking at one of the achievements of phenomenology from the perspective of someone rooted in the Thomistic tradition. I think everyone would agree among the phenomenologists here that this sort of enrichment of the moment of apprehension is one of the great achievements of phenomenology. But I wonder if any of you would like to comment on this. I don't think you're saying, Father James, that you don't think that say in discursive reasoning. And of course, my father's point is that the methodology is in part, it functions in different paradigmatic ways through the use of contrasts, for example. But nevertheless, I'd be curious, Pete or Maria or Dad, or I think we've lost Joseph here, or Maria Walter is with us. If you have any thoughts on phenomenology's genius also, let's just say, in the more discursive side of philosophical argumentation. Are we content to say that phenomenology is primarily a recovery of original experience, or is there not a much richer?
Oh, go ahead, Derek.
Maria, you go.
Well, thank you, Maria. John Henry, I mean, I just think that anyone who's spent time at philosophy conferences will recognize that there isn't general agreement about a lot of things. And so the notion that some people may disagree with this conception of apprehension, okay, then let's have the dialogue and the discussion. But I don't see how one can read the logical investigations and not think that there's this discursive side of phenomenology. It's just, or Roman Ingarden, I spent a great deal of time working on his work, or Joseph Seifert or others. And so a lot of this has to do with the nature of reason. And does reason include this moment of apprehension that can be discussed discursively, of course, but they're combined. So I had a colleague here at the University of Wisconsin who's since retired. He's a logician in the phenomenological tradition, taught me a great deal about the logic of Husserl and others. And so it's just not true that discursive element is absent. It's just an introduction of something that is really more profound as well. So agreement in the philosophical community is not there, but that doesn't mean things, to me, that's an invitation for discussion. Rather, in Anglo-American philosophy, unfortunately, there's a dismissal of this side, the phenomenological side. So I don't really see, I think this, to me at least, the discursive element when you read, I mean, I just invite anybody to sit down and read the logical investigations and all the tradition that's come out of that, the logical tradition, and say that it's not part of that tradition.
I'll just maybe just very briefly add to that, which is, I think it's been contained in the answers, but within discursive reasoning, you can make the distinction between, and this was part of the question, I read it, deductive reasoning and bringing to evidence, which is what John was talking about. And people, I think, confused, they identify discursive reasoning with deductive reasoning. And that's, I think, a wrong identification. Deductive reasoning is one species of discursive reasoning, but bringing to evidence is another one. And the examples that John, for example, gave, and I think, Derek, you're right. And anyway, so there's more to say.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah.
I just thought I would add, going along, I appreciate what Father James said there. In Aristotle, there's a place where I think he's talking about the principle of contradiction, and he says, whoever demands a proof for this just reveals by the asking their own lack of education, because they don't understand this intuition or this thing that the phenomenologists have focused on so much. And it also in book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle has those 5 types of knowledge, that most important one of intuition is this insight into reality that we've been talking about, that phenomenology has so put to the forefront. So it's present very prominently in Aristotle, that side of it of bringing to evidence and just seeing.
I take it that followers of von Hildebrand and Thomists are deep allies over and against, say, Kantian constructivists, who basically deny that there's an original moment of apprehension where we just receive and know the essences of things in themselves. So I just think that's a point of deep, deep common agreement.
Christopher, I think you were going to pose maybe perhaps even a final question.
Well, yeah, I realize that we're running near our time here, which is always difficult because we have so many good questions still yet to be posed. But I want to ask one final question, which I think is a very practical question and will maybe help people figure out what to do next. Because I'm sure when this ends, you're going to be wondering what to do next, what to do with all of your time. This is from Rachel Bullman. She asks, I'm sure that many would agree that personalism is the philosophy that we need today. Where would you suggest people begin if they would like to discover the history of personalism and its thought? Books, resources, lectures that you would suggest. She also asked the follow-up, which I'll invite people to comment on, as to whether personalism can be presented alone as a thought in itself, or is it necessary that it's presented in tandem or along with other thoughts, i.e. Thomistic personalism or phenomenological personalism, Christian personalism? Does it always have to have this sort of adjective, or can it just be a noun on its own? Before I invite other people to reply, I will say the first place I would recommend to go is to the Hildebrand Project YouTube channel. We have videos from all of our seminars, 10 years of them now, on there. And I mean, with the faculty you have here today, plus many others, I don't know if there is a greater resource for personalist thought than that. And then, of course, you know, we publish some books too, and we think it'd be just swell if you'd buy them, lots of them, in fact. And I'll mention again, we mentioned earlier that we do offer wholesale pricing for reading groups. So you don't have to be a store or anything. If you want to do a reading group with your friends, with your parish, classmates, whatever, it's on our website. And so we want to do everything we can to get these materials in people's hands. So we're very happy to help. And yeah, if you haven't checked out the previous seminars on YouTube, please go do so. So anyone else like to chime in on that?
I taught Burgos' book. I know Professor Crosby, I think you wrote the introduction to that book. I taught it in the spring. I teach at a state university. Despite the pandemic, it was well received. It's a really nice, it's not, he doesn't endorse von Hildebrand's form of personalism, but it's really a nice historical take on history of personalism. I liked it very much. I thought it was very helpful to our students.
John Crosby has a beautiful collection of essays called Personalist Papers, which I can highly recommend. They're very accessible and very deep at the same time, and I think a perfect introduction to personalism.
Thank you for that positive review, Maria.
I should also say that the Hildebrand Project is in the process of convening a group of associated scholars, and a number of them are on this faculty with us here. But the point of this is not just to give people titles, but actually to give some visibility to them in a shared place. And so each of these associated scholars will appear on our website. We're in the process of finalizing that. And in addition to their names and contact information, or the ability to contact them, there's also selected bibliography of work that is particularly relevant to either von Hildebrand or personalism. Our hope is to grow this group. It's a very inclusive sort of personalistic community, in the sense that it's not just that of von Hildebrand, but also Wojtyła and many others. And so that will be, I think, an ongoing resource as this community, which is just being gathered and put together, will be presented on our website. And also we hope that with time, and COVID is affecting our plans for this, so we may do this virtually for the time being, but that many of these associated scholars will also collaborate with us in hosting various kinds of circles in their home institutions, whether with students, so reading groups for students, or even for colleagues, if they have colleagues that they want to bring into their interests in personalism. and the project will be supporting that through the provision of books and providing either the shared space online or some resources. So that will be, let's just say that's a resource that is sort of in development that I think will be of great help. And again, it will be made as visible as possible through our website and also through social media. So I expect that it will actually be quite helpful to people who want to learn more, and also create points of entry for people who want to join smaller localized communities, or even if they're online communities, at least communities where they can participate in smaller groups.
So with that, John Henry, I see you're already talking about the future, and maybe we should turn to that. We're just about out of time here, so I want to our faculty, all of the attendees and participants. It's been a wonderful experience, and we hope to do it again. John Henry, I'm sure you have some closing thoughts.
Well, yes. First of all, I want to thank all of the faculty for their participation. Most of you are here, a few are not. We'll have to thank them offline, but I just want to thank each one of you for your participation, for the wonderful presentations that you prepared so thoughtfully, also the wonderful answers you gave to the questions. My feeling was, in listening to you all speak, especially in the questions, how deeply formed you all are by this personalism, by the Hildebrandian, the Wojtyłan, JP, the thought of John Paul, and many, many others. And so you are able to present this intellectual tradition with such vividness and also personal authenticity. And I know that's very compelling. So I thank all of you very, very much. And I hope that you'll continue to participate in our summer seminars. The Hildebrand Project is a dynamic place, and there is much to come in the future. I'm sure that the use of virtual events will continue. Certainly in this COVID era, we will continue to make use of it, but even after that passes, or whatever that actually means, even when we come back to in-person events in some form or other, I think we will continue to use this. I think all of us have found that the impersonal dimensions of being connected through technology have somehow collapsed in this experience among us. And I know, Pete, you think in part that's because there's already a lot of community amongst us, but it's remarkable how even if there's a little community to start amongst all of us, it seems to spread to people even who are with us for the first time. So we'll continue to do this. Christopher has pointed out we have books forthcoming, and we look forward to telling you about those. I want to invite those of you who are participants and attendees. If you have applied as a participant, you are perhaps on our email newsletter, or you have been added to it. Thank you for giving us your consent there. This is the best way to remain abreast of our many publications, events, and announcements, and so on, also on social media. So I just invite anyone who is not following us in that way to please do so. Also, those of you watching us on Facebook Live, follow us on social media, or follow us through our email newsletter, where you can really keep abreast of our work. And then last but not least, as you all know, I think everyone knows here that the project is well, Christopher sometimes says that he works on the business end of philosophy, but that maybe overstates the profitability of this kind of work. In reality, it is entirely supported by our benefactors, and one has to give special thanks to certain benefactors who are the mainstays of the organization, who provide very substantial support. We couldn't do it without them. But we also depend very, very much on our smaller benefactors, particularly those who support us on a monthly basis. We say often, there's simply no gift that's too small to make a difference. Someone who gives a $5 monthly contribution, that amount of money can support for example, a social media post that reaches more widely, introduces someone to a book, leads that person to purchase the book or borrow the book from the library. So even very small gifts that may be seemingly too small to make any kind of material difference, on the contrary, they make a great difference. And then of course there's strength in numbers. When many of you come together in a significant way, that is to say, when many of you come together even with small gifts, but there are many of you, those gifts add up. So I would simply invite you all to join us, not just by following us and reading our materials and reviewing our books, but also to the extent that you can with your financial support. And in particular, I would invite those monthly gifts. Those make a huge difference. If someone makes a gift even of $5 a month, depending on what part of the world you're in, that's either one coffee or maybe several coffees, maybe less than one coffee in New York City. But in any case, it's a manageable amount, I think, for many people, also for many students, and yet it adds up. It's $60 a year. And then if there are 100 of you doing that, suddenly there's a really meaningful amount that's been raised. It's not lost on us that if everyone who participates in these seminars became a monthly donor, we could in fact support the event almost on the basis of those monthly donors alone. That would be a very powerful thing. And as we head into a very uncertain future where our larger donors are perhaps more at risk and where their support is in question, suddenly it really comes, I think it would not be an overstatement to say that those of you who make those small and faithful and ongoing gifts can actually ensure that the project continues to offer its summer seminar. It doesn't have to scale back. And I don't mean to sound, a needless alarm, but I think we all know that we're in a very uncertain world, and we think that the voice of the great personalist thinkers, the witness of the great personalist thinkers, is a vital voice today that we can't afford to lose. So in any case, my invitation is that you support us as you're able. Catherine, I think, has put or is putting the link to our donation form into the chat. We'll also be following up today or tomorrow with an email, including some videos already from the seminar, but also with a link to our website where you can join us in support. And just I have to say it. I know I'm speaking in large measure to students, but I know there are some of you on here who are in different places in life where your resources are much greater. Don't assume you need to give us $5 a month. Buy us 10 coffees a month or 100 coffees a month. But those of you who can buy us one a month, please do that as well. So on that note, let me not end only with a request, but also with a word of profound thanks to all of you for joining us. Your participation is what allows us to realize our mission in spreading this precious legacy of the thought and the witness of Dietrich von Hildebrand and the tradition of Christian personalism. So thank you very, very much. God bless you all, and we look forward to welcoming you in the future. And on that final note, I just want to give my colleagues Christopher Haley and Catherine Beagle a chance to bid you all a fair word of farewell.
Yeah, I just want to add my voice of thank you to all of our faculty and attendees. It's been a real privilege to spend the week with all of you, and I'm glad that you were able to join us in this virtual format. It wasn't quite the same as having you all here on campus and spending nights around the fountain, but I'm very hopeful that we can do that next year, and I hope that each of you consider joining us next year as well, and taking this message of the heart back into your circles of friends, in your smaller communities in your areas. If you need anything from me, by all means, shoot me an email, let me know. I'd love to stay in touch with each of you. But thank you all for joining us.
I want to close just with replying to a couple of comments I see here in the chat. Someone asked if there's a way to, stay in touch and get calls for papers and things. We have an alumni group for summer seminar attendees on Facebook. Please go ahead and submit a request to join that. We'll try to invite people if you've shared your Facebook pages with us. So that's a great place to share ongoing events and things like this. Also we are, as John Henry mentioned, developing this Associated Scholars community, which will be another great way to do so. And I noticed another comment from our dear friend Rachel Bullman, who noted that everyone here is always very gracious and happy to answer your questions, and that is very true. So not to put you all on the spot and cause a flood of emails, but I know that all of our faculty and everyone here at the Hildebrand Project is always very happy to hear from you all, happy to help with whatever questions. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And if you have ideas for other things that we can do or ways to be involved in things that you're doing, please let us know. For those of you whom we're just meeting for the first time here online, we very much look forward to meeting you in person soon. To our friends whom we've seen before in person, we very much look forward to seeing you again very soon. So with that, I thank you all and bid you adieu.